Okay. I'm pretty sure this is it. Yep. Yep. This is gonna be a ride. I haven't been on the slide in so long. It's called The Many Photoshop Bryans. It's a collaboration between a lot of people that I'm with, but mostly I made these. So, codes: black made by Bryan, which is me, and then yellow made by Evil Bryan, which is a different person. Purple made by Gender Swap Bryan and Toy Bryan, another person. Blue made by Werewolf Bryan and Kid Bryan. Multiple people. Main person, inside color, helper, borderlines. Okay. This suit Bryan. Status Bryan. Mustache Bryan. Old man Bryan. Neighbor Bryan. Gender Swap Bryan. Clickbait Bryan. Woo Bryan. Tennis Bryan. Naruto Bryan. Evil Bryan. Donald Trump Bryan. Hillary Clinton Bryan. Statue Bryan. Disco Bryan. Slenderman Bryan. Rockstar Freddy Bryan. Astronaut Bryan. Tic Tac Bryan. Pink Fluffy Unicorns Dancing on Rainbows Bryan. Emo Bryan. Purple Guy Bryan. Okay Bryan. Cell Bryan. Glasses Bryan. Weird eyebrow, big forehead Bryan. Stretch Bryan. Unicorn Bryan. Mario Bryan. Hawaii Bryan. Oh, Hawaiian Bryan. Kitty Cat Bryan. Suit Bryan Jr. Love Bryan. Pony Bryan. Please sit down Bryan. Bryan Griffin. Fade Bryan. Werewolf Bryan. We're on slide 40. Sans Bryan, my baby. Oh yeah, there's Split Bryan. If you don't know who Split Bryan is, so there was Soup Bryan, and then there's just Split Bryan, from my version, like different versions of Bryan versus the Bears singing battle. This is Split Bryan, and then there was Soup Bryan. Baby Bryan. Wait, did I do Split Bryan? I don't think I did Split Bryan. I did Crazy Bryan. I did Split Bryan. Baby Bryan. Pride Bryan. If you don't know, Sans Bryan, Soup Bryan, and Pride Bryan, I think were all of my profiles. Masky Bryan. Chara Bryan. Frisk Bryan. Harry Potter Bryan. Thanos Bryan. Thanos Bryan Remastered. Egyptian Bryan. Goat Bryan. Horse Bryan. Papyrus Bryan. Mute Bryan. Crazy Bryan. Crazy Bryan's twin, and that this was another one in the singing battle, but I honestly like Crazy Bryan more. I like the original better just because of the freaking hand. But I also made the actual hand, and I also made him look crazier. So I like both of them. Demon Bryan, Baby Yoda Bryan, Crayon Obsessed Bryan, Lol Bryan, Country Ball Obsessed Bryan, Blah Bryan, Angel Bryan, Pop-Tart Bryan. I actually did edit the Pop-Tart box. We can do it, Bryan! Oh no, I know which one this is, and we're on slide 66. I know which one this is. Scream, Bryan! Uncle Sam Bryan. Sugar Skull Bryan. Stormtrooper Bryan. Unicorn Bryan Remastered. I actually really like how this one turned out. I put a lot of work into this. Penguin Bryan. Markiplier Bryan. I also put a lot of work into this one too. Two-Face Bryan is one of my favorite ones. Just because of how much work I literally put into, like, overlapping the freaking things. It took so long. Dinosaur Bryan. Llama Bryan. Disney Bryan. I did that as a joke. Goodbye Bryan. Random color generator Bryan. Baby Bryan Remastered. I don't even know why they made this. It's like blonde hair, blue eyes Bryan. Albino Bryan. Statue Bryan Remastered. Ghost Bryan. This one's actually really cute. Eye Patch Bryan. I made this one out of the Gotcha eye patch. Father Suit Bryan. I was gonna do Daddy Suit Bryan, but then somebody said no. Jason Bryan. There's Jason. It's Jason. It's Bryan. I really like how this one turned out. Angry Teacher Bryan. Pudding Bryan. Mask Bryan. I didn't put the text for this one. This is Mask Bryan. The many Photoshop Minecraft Bryans. Now we're on slide 90. It said made by Bryan and only Bryan. Aggravated Bryan. Demented Bryan Sr. No, remember, these were made like a year ago. Demented Bryan Jr. Evil Bryan Evolution. The Bryans is Brianna, Evil Bryan, Werewolf Bryan, DeAndre Bryan, Toy Bryan, Kid Bryan. No wait, Kid Bryan, Toy Bryan, Animatronic Bryan, Spanish Bryan, Bryan, Evil Brianna. Serious Bryan, and there's Bryan in his suit, and then there's Evil Bryan. Just not to get confused. The emotions of Evil Bryan, and this is like around like my time in my suicide series, and so there's upset, there's scared, and then there's sadness. Fan art Bryan. This is a bunch of fan art I found. Fan art Bryan 2. Fan art Bryan 3. Oh, those are teasers. It's a freaking. These are just my suicide teasers, actually. You killed them. It's all your fault. Murder or die, just die. You're you're no better than him. They all hate you. Insane liar. You're just like Afton freak. Yeah, it's called Depressed Bryan. Wait, this was called Hangman Bryan. And this was called Depressed Bryan. Kidnap Bryan. Yeah, somebody remade this for me. I am so happy how it turned out. It looks so freaking good. And then it's the end. 105 slides of just pure randomness of the famous films, many Photoshop Bryans. It's so freaking weird, but I love it so much. And this is my child. I will forever cherish this. So yeah. If you want me to do any more, if you want me to do like a document, old documents I made of about Bryan, then I will. Okay, goodbye.